Hello everyone, my name is Tax Albert and this is a response to extra credits video where games do Cthulhu wrong, the problem with horror games. Now this is a very late response. Extra credits video, to which I'm going to link in the channel description, came out more than 2 years ago, but in the context of the Lovecraftian video game retrospective I'm doing, I stumbled across this video and I thought that it deserved a response nevertheless, and despite its age it still ranks fairly high in searches. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through the video. It's less than 6 minutes long and I'm going to pause it at times to share my thoughts on what they say in this video. Okay, so let's start.
Hey folks, before we begin, allow me to introduce you to Juan Fernando, lead artist at Relic Entertainment. He's here today to help us talk about Cthulhu. We mentioned doing an episode on this before, and I was gonna save this for Halloween, but so many of you are interested that we decided to go ahead and just talk about it now. Here is why games generally use Cthulhu so poorly. The answer is fairly simple. Cthulhu isn't a creature, it's an idea, an existential terror. Cthulhu represents our fear of the possibility of our own human smallness.
Now here's the first issue I have with the video. Cthulhu is very much a creature. While I would agree that generally spoken, in Lovecraftian horror, the biggest horror is a threat from the outside universe that humanity can't really understand. But Cthulhu is very much a creature. Cthulhu can sleep and Cthulhu can be rammed with a boat and it can be damaged by a boat. Is Cthulhu a creature we can't fully comprehend? Yeah. Is Cthulhu a creature that has extraordinary powers that are beyond what humanity can probably ever do? Yes, but Cthulhu is still a creature. And it's not just an idea, and that's true for a lot of Lovecraftian creatures, more so even. Take for example the deep ones from Shadow over Innsmouth. Those ones are very much physical creatures. They can even interbreed with humans, or humans can be turned into them. So the idea that Lovecraftian creatures are just ideas is not true, and I would say that's true for not only the slightly more mundane Lovecraftian creatures, but also for the more godlike ones.
Cthulhu presents us with the revelation of forces that are so much larger than us that they're beyond our control or even our understanding. The fear in Cthulhu is in how it shatters our fundamental understanding of our own importance in the universe. To look on Cthulhu is to go mad.
Again, that's not actually true. The narrator from The Call of Cthulhu he's not gone completely mad, even though he saw Cthulhu and even confronted him in battle, if you want to use that term. And while he probably suffered from that, mentally and probably physically, it's not true that you can't just look at Cthulhu. You can. Is Cthulhu something that we still can't comprehend just because it's something we can, in a certain sense, see? Yes, but once more, you can look at Cthulhu. Cthulhu does have a material and probably even a mundane aspect. Is that its most important aspect? Probably not, but it's definitely there.
This is why it can't be an enemy in a game. It can't simply be a squiddy monstrosity that we're meant to fight. It can't even be a giant tentacled boss, because the moment I can shoot Cthulhu in the face is the moment that Cthulhu loses all of its effect.
So this is another issue I have with the video. Name me a game where you can actually shoot Cthulhu in the face. Now, there are a couple of games where that is the case, but all of them are pretty much humorous or more lighthearted games, or games that don't try to emulate Lovecraftian horror in any way. You can face off against Cthulhu in Pray for Death, but Pray for Death is ultimately just a silly fighting game, and it's meant to be a silly fighting game. It's not meant to capture Lovecraftian horror. Another game where you can face off against Cthulhu with serial numbers filed off is World of Warcraft, where there's a creature called Cthulhu. But again, Lovecraft is a very lighthearted game, and overall it's not a game that attempts to emulate Lovecraftian horror. Maybe it's a little bit darker in certain scenes and stages, but it's not a Lovecraftian game in total.
The fear in Cthulhu is not that it's powerful, it's that it's powerful on a scale we can't even comprehend. We have no way to relate its unknowable vastness and illimitable power to our own mortal abilities. To make it possible for Cthulhu to bleed, to even just give it a life bar, is to give the players some shred of hope that they might have a chance.
Now here we're back at Call of Cthulhu, and that story clearly demonstrated you do have a chance. You can escape Cthulhu. Can you kill Cthulhu? Most likely not. Can you damage Cthulhu without Cthulhu pretty much regenerating straight away? No. But the ship in Call of Cthulhu clearly rams him, and they manage to escape. Do they escape forever? Maybe not, we don't know. But the fact that Cthulhu is essentially completely invulnerable and you have no chance whatsoever, That's actually not true, and the story demonstrates that quite nicely.
It gives them some vector of understanding the thing they face. That's not how Cthulhu works. And yet, all too often, games either make Cthulhu an enemy or give you the goal of sealing up Cthulhu or banishing it from this plane.
Now, this leads us back to games where you can actually face off against Cthulhu, and the problem is, what games are these? So, Extra Credits doesn't mention a single example here, and I think there's a reason for that, and that is, this example just doesn't exist. So I'm doing a retrospective on Lovecraftian games, and while I don't claim to be an expert on that, I claim to have a fairly good overview over what Lovecraftian games there are, and generally they fall into two categories, or you could sort them into two categories. First category are games that do try to capture an overall Lovecraftian feel, both in the atmosphere and the design. And second category are games that take Lovecraftian elements, such as characters, or some ideas, but they are more humorous, more lighthearted, or they do overall not try to emulate Lovecraftian horror. If you look, for example, at Call of Cthulhu Shadow of the Command, or The Lurking Horror, or Anchorhead, then those are all adventure games. You don't fight Cthulhu in those games. In some of those games you don't even fight anybody at all. You don't seal away Cthulhu. Cthulhu doesn't have health bar. In fact, Cthulhu doesn't even appear. That's the thing. And Cthulhu, as mentioned before, does appear in a couple of games, but those games are generally not games that do try to emulate Lovecraftian horror at all, so I think it would be unfair to criticize them for using Cthulhu in a way. Obviously, games such as The Flappy Cthulhu, they're just silly little games. They don't try to emulate Lovecraftian horror, and that's why they fail at it, because they don't attempt it in the first place. Now, there are a couple of games that are a little more serious that do feature Lovecraftian deities, namely Shin Megami Tensei and Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth, and I'm not going to discuss those two games, and there will be mild spoilers for both of them, so if you don't want to have the story of those spoiled for you in parts, click on the annotation you'll find on the screen right now. Now, Shin Megami Tensei does feature Nyarlathotep a couple of times, but again, it's not a game that I would attribute to being a Lovecraftian game. And Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth is definitely trying to emulate that, but in that game you don't actually meet Cthulhu. You do see Cthulhu statues, but you don't meet Cthulhu himself. Whom you do meet are Dagon and Mother Hydra. You never fight Mother Hydra, you just fight her minions, and you do fight Dagon on a military vessel. And you do shoot Dagon in the face a couple of times and he disappears. But the thing here is that this is very akin to what happens to Cthulhu in the Call of Cthulhu, in the sense that you probably just scared away Dagon and didn't kill him. And the thing with Dagon is that Dagon is maybe a god? We don't really know. Dagon could just be a really large deep one, an ancient deep one that is very powerful and very hard to kill, maybe even impossible to kill, but not necessarily a creature that is truly on a god level. We don't know. In any case, even those games don't feature Cthulhu with a health bar.
This shows a complete misunderstanding of what makes Cthulhu work. I mean, remember that at the end of the Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft has the crew of the Alert, the vessel that finds Cthulhu, ram the eldritch creature to zero effect, just to show how futile and inconsequential human actions are to it.
This is completely wrong. The vessel rams Cthulhu, Cthulhu gets damaged, and the ship escapes. And this makes me question whether they actually read the story, which they probably didn't, because the story isn't very long, and if they did read it, then they should know that this is not what happens.
Cthulhu can't be an enemy or a goal, it should be a presence, an insurmountable shadow that looms over our adventures. Our desperate hope shouldn't be in our power to withstand it, but in the possibility that maybe we're too inconsequential for it to notice us. Unfortunately, this goes against what games are usually about. In general, games are about empowerment. They're about making us the hero, making us larger than life, making us more important in their world than we could ever be in ours. And this goes directly against the fundamental terror that lurks behind Cthulhu. It's possible, though, that we might be able to get around this in games. Parts of Dark Souls and Demon Souls, some of the Silent Hill franchise, and even System Shock 2 at times, manage to deliver that disempowering sense of smallness.
I think these are, for the most part, very poor examples, especially the Soul series and System Shock, because in those games, you run around with a weapon and you kill hundreds of beings. Maybe you feel slightly weaker than you would feel in other games, because it's easy to get killed, but compared to the adventure games I mentioned earlier, where you can't even fight, those games are very, very poor examples, and you are definitely empowered in those games. I mean, Or can any Dark Souls player perform what the character in Dark Souls does? Well, I certainly can't, and I very much doubt that even a fraction of humanity could pull that off. So these games are very much about empowerment. It doesn't really mean that they're easy, but you are definitely playing a character that does pull off feats which are way, way beyond what any normal human being could do.
But there's another problem that goes with delivering on the idea of Cthulhu. The terror behind Cthulhu is in the fear of lack of control. While we think we're in control, and that we're the dominant species, and that there's no problem that our mind can't master, the Cthulhu mythos makes this a carefully constructed lie, maintainable only through our own ignorance. Terror and madness comes when the veil is ripped away. So how do we capture that in a game? How do we really bring in the idea of Cthulhu, the horror that true lack of control inspires? If it were me, I'd play against the expectations that games set up for us. The further into the game the player went, the more I'd make them realize how little control they actually had. The more I'd expose them to bouts of Eternal Darkness-esque insanity.
This is again a very poor example, because in Eternal Darkness, later in the game, you actually do get a spell that allows you to restore your sanity. And so later in the game, sanity is almost never a problem. You can just press a button and bam, all your sanity is back. So why did I choose this as an example? This is a very poor example, and this does highlight an issue with video games in general, that sanity mechanics aren't easy to replicate. Call of Cthulhu Dark Corners of the Earth has one, where if you witness too many terrifying things in too short amount of time, you go insane and you lose. It's not perfect. Is it better than Eternal Darkness's sanity mechanic? Maybe, but in any case, this is not a very good example.
And where normal games go out of their way to point out to you just how meaningful your decisions were, I'd turn the tables and late in the game, show the player just how meaningless, how inconsequential all of those big decisions they thought they were making really were.
This is an absolutely terrible idea, because if all my decisions are completely meaningless, why am I playing a video game? A video game is an interactive medium, ultimately. Now, there are a couple of games which are essentially just exploration, and which are not very interactive at all, but overall it is an interactive medium. So if I have a video game where it doesn't really matter what I do, why should I even play it? Maybe to see the cutscenes or to follow the story, but if that's the case, why not make it a movie or a TV series? If all of my actions are inconsequential, what's the point in making them in the first place?
I wouldn't guarantee the happy end you normally see from video games either. I wouldn't have you win.
Now, you could argue that most video games do have a happy ending, but again, if we're looking at the Lovecraftian games, then this is not true at all, and the more serious games do not necessarily have a happy ending. In a lot of them, you merely escape, so you get away, but you just save your life and nothing else. And in fact, a couple of them, for example, Prisoner of Ice, depending on what kind of ending you actually reach, they do have an ending where everything you did maybe just delayed whatever is going to happen, and you can barely call yourself a winner. So you could argue that the more serious Lovecraftian games already do this. But again, the problem here is that they don't name any examples, and it makes me question whether they actually checked out Lovecraftian video games.
I'd have a debatable best ending. Is simply surviving the best ending?
As I've said, this is already the case.
In the ending you got, did your character go mad, or was the ending even what really happened? I'd force the player, as a human being, not as the character in the game, to try to make sense of the obscure. I'd also have most of the NPCs in the game not be in on the mythos.
Again, this is already the case. In the more serious Lovecraftian games, generally only the main character, after a certain amount of time, a couple of selected other characters, and the bad guys are in on the mythos. So what he's recommending here is something that's already the case.
In the world Lovecraft creates, most people would think that any mention of the creeping things, the colors out of space, were a sign of madness. If the player tried to talk to them about the experiences they were having, they'd simply be shunned, or possibly thrown into a ward. Because part of Cthulhu is isolation. It's having an experience the world needs to know but that no one's willing to accept. Part of Cthulhu is in questioning your own sanity, and having to ask your rational self whether it's more reasonable to think that the entire world is ignorant to their peril, or that you yourself just might have gone mad. For those of you who have played the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, you know that it's perhaps one of the best systems for capturing this.
Now, this depends very much on the campaign your game master is running. Now, it's very difficult to determine how a role-playing game actually goes, because You can look at sample adventures, you can look at officially published adventures, but ultimately it's very much up to the group what actually happens. Whereas in video games, it's generally determined by the developers what is possible and what isn't. But I can tell you that in a lot of officially published Call of Cthulhu adventures, there's a good deal of combat, and you do fight off a lot of cultists and weaker Lovecraftian creatures, and those are very, very killable. In fact, if you have a shotgun, you are decently skilled in it, and you do fight on close range, you can blast away a lot of creatures. And of course there are Lovecraftian gods as well, but you're not supposed to fight those anyway. So again, I would say that those games don't actually go like this. Yes, you can design a Call of Cthulhu adventure where in the end everything was for nothing and your characters probably didn't even experience what they really thought they were experiencing, but it's up to the game master, and for officially published Call of Cthulhu adventures, this is generally not true. A lot of them do have a happy ending, a lot of them have an ending where at least everybody survives, and maybe you save a couple of people. So this complete hopelessness, that's not really what's going to happen.
And much of that lies in the fact that every character is, in the end, doomed to madness.
This is a very terrible cliche about the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. It's sometimes called the game where everybody goes mad at the end, but this is by no means bound to happen, and in my experience it's equally likely that your characters just get killed, which can also be the case in a lot of other adventures. And it depends very much on what kind of game your game master is actually running. So generally saying that in that game everybody goes insane at the end is a very cliched generalization.
They aren't precious or mighty, they aren't even heroes. They are simply people trying to follow their curiosity to its inevitable end. So to use Cthulhu right, to create a game that's not about some big scary-looking cephalopod, but is really about delivering the terror that Cthulhu evokes in Lovecraft stories, we have to turn much of what we know about games on their head. First, we have to get rid of the idea that Cthulhu is a creature to be overcome or defeated.
I've said it before, and I'm going to say it again. The game that's a serious Lovecraftian game, that's supposed to invoke Lovecraftian horror, and where Cthulhu is still a boss with a health bar, doesn't really exist in the first place. So you're complaining about games that don't exist, and I doubt you did your research on this. Otherwise, you'll probably be aware that most of the games where you do face Cthulhu as a more or less mundane enemies are light-hearted games, which don't attempt to capture Lovecraftian horror in the first place, such as a Lovecraftian-themed Space Invaders you're showing on the screen right now.
Then, like in most truly good horror, we have to move away from an empowerment fantasy, instead allowing us to feel disempowered while safely ensconced in our own rooms. And lastly, we have to move away from the feeling of control, the feeling of agency that almost all games impart simply by their nature as part of an interactive medium. And to do that, we're really going to have to play against the expectations that years of playing games have instilled in most of us. We'll have to upset the player's sense of control in both the narrative and the play without interrupting the flow of gameplay itself, and in the end, leave them questioning their character's sanity.
As previously mentioned, most of the games that do take Lovecraftian horror very seriously and do emulate Lovecraftian horror are adventure-style games anyway, and they're very, very linear anyway, so there's very limited control over what the player can actually do anyway. So you just play through the games, you pretty much have to do what you have to do, and that's it. So there's no need to take control away from the player with regard to the narrative, because the players don't have that control in the first place.
If we can do all that, if we can move away from fighting Cthulhu to living in a world where its existence exerts an inexorable force on existence itself, perhaps when you turn off the controller and tuck under the covers for the night, maybe we can leave you awake, staring into the dark, wondering what really is outside the window, what sits waiting just past the dimness you can see. Maybe we can leave you with that horror and that smallness that Lovecraft brings. If that's what you really want, of course. Sweet dreams.
This video highlights nicely that I doubt that Extra Credits put any research in this video at all, because they don't name any examples, neither do they name good examples, nor do they name bad examples. They do name some examples of games that allegedly do not empower the player, or make the player weaker than in an average video game, but they don't name a single negative example of a Lovecraftian game that does Lovecraft wrong, and nor do they name a single specific Lovecraftian game where Lovecraft is done correctly. So my conclusion is that Extra Credit didn't really do their research. If they had, then they would know that a lot of the recommendations they make here have already been followed from day one when The Lurking Horror, which from what I could find out is the first Lovecraftian game, was released. And they're essentially complaining about a problem that doesn't exist in the first place, because all the games where you can actually face off against Cthulhu are not true Lovecraftian games anyway, so what they're complaining about isn't really an issue. So thanks for watching. I'm Pax Albert, and if you want to share your thoughts on Lovecraftian video games, feel free to do so in the comment section. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you next time. Take care and goodbye.